What's up, everybody? With TOGC coming out soon and ICC on the horizon, I thought it'd be a good time to go through some things that everybody can do to become a better player in World of Warcraft. With Warcraft logs, players are constantly comparing themselves to each other, so let's talk about what you can do to help separate yourself from the pack and consistently earn those 99 parses. First up, let's start off with what I like to call your ABCs, or always be casting. Now this one is exactly what it sounds like. You always want to be casting a spell that deals damage to the boss. But it's more than that. When the boss is pulled, you want to make sure that you're casting a spell that lands when the pull timer hits 0. If you're moving, then make sure you're casting a spell on the move. Even though you might not be performing your optimal rotation on the move, you always want to be doing as much damage as possible, so make sure that you know what abilities are best used on the move for your class. Make sure that you're always casting a spell immediately after another one. So if you're casting like a Shadow Bolt, you can queue a spell into that and it'll cast instantly. This is done using the spell queue window, which is a default setting that exists within World of Warcraft. You can modify the size of this window so that, either the closer to your spell ending or the further away from it, you can queue a spell so that you don't need to time it as soon as the spell ends. If you're casting a channeled spell like Arcane Missiles, Mind Flay, or Drain Soul, then make sure that you're casting a spell immediately after it ends. There are some really great tools that can help you figure out as soon as a tick ends. Gnosis and Quartz are great cast bars that show ticks in channeled spells, and Gnosis even has an option to play a sound when a tick happens. So for example, if you want to cast a 2-tick Mind Flay, you can listen for the tick to happen and you don't need to rely on your eyes watching your cast bar. I've personally found that this has helped me with clipping and just casting a spell as soon as my Mind Flay ends, as I like to pair the sound with the visual of the cast bar. Now this ties directly into tip number 2, which is pre-plan your movement. So we just talked about DPSing on the move. Now let's talk about knowing where to move. So if you think of dodging fire on Mimiron or running into void zones on Algalon, for all of these mechanics, you can plan where you need to move before you actually have to do so. So when you know where the fire is on Mimiron and where it's coming from, you know where you want to run to get away from it. You can see where the void zones are on Algalon. So if you're not near those spots, you can inch towards them by stutter stepping. This means that you're casting an instant spell and moving during that global cooldown. So a good example of this would be a Shadow Priest casting Devouring Plague or Shadow or Death, Fire Mages using a Hot Streak Pyroblast, or a Warlock using Life Tap. These are all spells that are instant. You can't cast another spell immediately. You have to wait for the global cooldown. And during that time, you can just slowly make your way towards where you need to go. So you cast a spell, you move a little bit, you plant yourself, you cast another instant spell, and then you just kind of keep inching your way towards where you need to go. You can move across an entire arena if you plan early enough. So know where you need to go to do mechanics and slowly work your way there over the course of a fight. You will save so much DPS by slowly inching your way towards where you need to go instead of just beelining it and running for 5 seconds straight. That's going to lose you a lot of DPS and a lot of uptime on the boss. Top players are always maximizing their damage while on the move. Alright, tip number 3. Know your fight lengths and make sure you're maximizing your cooldowns within that fight length. So if a fight is short and you only get one use of your strongest ability, your strongest cooldown, then it's probably going to be optimal to use it during Bloodlust, which would probably happen on the pull. But what about for other fights? You're going to get multiple uses of your big cooldowns, and you want to make sure that you're using them at the best time, although making sure that you don't lose a use of that cooldown. It's perfectly fine to delay a use of it, as long as it's not going to prevent you from getting another use later on. Now an example of this that actually happens to me quite often would be Shadow Fiend on Algalon. Now our Algalon kills can be around 4.5 minutes, which means since Shadow Fiend is a 3-minute cooldown when talented, I'm only going to get 2 uses at best throughout the fight. I'm going to use it first on pull. It's going to be my first global cooldown so that I can benefit from Lust on the pull. But after that, I'm going to have a 1.5-minute window when it's off cooldown and I can choose when to use it. Now, Shadow doesn't have a ton of buffs for Shadow Fiend, but the one thing that you might have is a Flare of the Heavens or a Dying Curse, a trinket with a really strong spell power proc. Well, Shadow Fiend scales off the spell power, so what you want to do is you want to make sure that you use it at a time when you have that buff on your character. And since I have a minute and a half to play with before the boss will die after Shadow Fiend is off cooldown, the internal cooldown on these trinkets is only 45 seconds, which means there's plenty of time that even if it procced just before Shadow Fiend comes off cooldown, you can wait 45 seconds, use your Shadow Fiend with the buff, and you still have another 45 seconds until the boss is going to die. Now you might be asking, how do I know how long a fight's going to last? There's an awesome weak aura called Time to Die that you can actually customize so that you can show when the boss is going to reach any percentage of health. So you can see 35% if that's when your execute starts. You can see 20% on Algalon, and you can see 0% for when the boss dies. The way it works is it calculates your raid DPS in that moment and then is just going to do the math to figure out, okay, how long with this DPS until the boss dies. Now, damage changes throughout a fight. If you're watching this timer during Lust, it's going to be a lot shorter than when Lust falls off. It's not going to take into account execute damage at the end of the fight. But if people are dead, then it will show that you're going to have less damage on the boss, and it's going to take longer to kill. It's definitely not perfect, but I highly recommend it to anybody who's trying to maximize their cooldowns, as it really does give you the best understanding of how long a fight is going to last. All right, tip number 4, have a clean and functional UI. So I think a lot of times a people's UI is almost like another raid boss that they're battling with during the fight itself. They have so much information and it's so cluttered that it can be hard to pick out the things that are actually important on the screen. My UI is something that I've put a lot of time into setting up. I do believe a good UI makes it easier to know where to move during a fight. It can help you with your rotation. It can help you time your cooldowns. There's so much to gain from having a clean and functional UI. So I would spend some time trying to figure out what's actually important on your screen and eliminate the rest. If you don't record your gameplay, then try to take a screenshot in the middle of the fight sometime. Just press print screen a few times and then check your screenshots folder after. Take a look. Is the stuff on there important? Most of it probably is, but I'm sure you have some clutter from add-ons that your friends might have told you about, or a weak aura that sounded good when you first saw it, but you never actually use it and now it's just taking up space on your screen. I have a video where I talk about my UI and why I've set it up the way that I have. I go into a lot of detail talking about each section of my screen and how I prioritize what I put there. I think going through your UI and removing the clutter is a good exercise for everybody to go through every few months, just to make sure you don't accumulate a bunch of junk on your screen. It's basically spring cleaning, but for World of Warcraft. Now, my final tip ties into everything that I've talked about so far, but admittedly, it is the most try-hard of all the tips. Memorize your rotation. And this does not mean to know your rotation. This means you memorize it to the point you know it like the back of your hand. Now, the reason for this is because most fights aren't just standstill and DPS, especially as we get further into Wrath, and then as we make our way into Kata or, whatever comes next. The fights get harder and more complex, and there's going to be more mechanics that need to be done throughout the fight. If you have your rotation memorized, then that's less brain power that you need to use to perform it well, which means more brain power that you can use on mechanics of the fight while still doing your maximum damage. So this means even as your mind is focused on other things, you can still perform your rotation perfectly, or at least as close to perfect as you can get it. Now, how do you practice this? Because this is a little bit harder than just standing at a target dummy and DPSing, right? Because that's not giving you that same raid environment feel. But I will admit, something that I like to do when I play a new class is I do DPS on the target dummy. But I'm not standing still and DPSing. I give myself targets that I want to move to and pretend that I'm in a fight. I pretend that there's a frost bomb next to me that's going to explode in 6 seconds and I need to move 20 yards away. And I try to do this while maintaining my rotation. Now, this ties into all the previous tips. Pre-plan your movement. Make sure you're always casting. Now, I know this doesn't fully simulate the raid experience, but try it. I guarantee you'll find it a lot harder than just standing still and DPSing a target dummy like you've probably done in the past. If you do memorize your rotation, then you'll be able to focus on everything else that's happening in the fight and still crush the meters. I promise you that. Now, I think a lot of these tips are things that most people do on their own, but they haven't intentionally sat down and thought about them in detail. Nothing here is too difficult for anybody to do, and I think a lot of us want to get better, but just haven't been intentional about making these changes. So let me know your thoughts. Did this help, or am I a total degen for spending so much time perfecting a video game? I'd love to hear your thoughts. But I hope these tips were helpful, and good luck to you in your next raid. Let me know if anything I said here helps you perform and helps you actually execute a fight better than you previously have. Anyway, that's all for this video. My name's Pantsface, and I'll see you in the next one.